So yeah, I thought it would be good to start with a quick introduction to Hedgehog Street for anybody who hasn't come across the project before. I'll talk a little bit about our upcoming projects and the things that we're doing, things that are keeping us busy this year, and then we can bring in Tom and start chatting about his fantastic new book. So let's get started. There is a picture of the book if anybody's wondering what it looks like. Yeah, so Ghosts in the Hedgerow. Here we go. So just a quick bit of background information on Hedgehog Street. I know a lot of you will have heard of Hedgehog Street, but just for anybody who's new to the project, it's a joint conservation campaign between two British wildlife charities, so People's Trust for Endangered Species and the British Hedgehog Preservation Society. So PTS does a lot of work in Britain with key species and habitats, so they work on, of course, hedgehogs. And they also work on things like water voles. There's stag beetle projects, hazel dormice. And on the habitat side of things, we work with hedgerows, which are wonderful for wildlife, and also traditional orchards and pastures. BHPS is the British Hedgehog Preservation Society. What it says on the tin, really, they're a British charity working to conserve the West European hedgehog, which is our one native species here in Britain. The project was launched back in 2011, so we are now 12 years old. And it was launched following research that had shown that fragmented habitat was affecting hedgehogs, and that actually there'd been some really quite dramatic declines seen in British hedgehogs. So it was this idea of kind of joining up habitat and raising awareness of hedgehogs and what people can do to help them. So at the moment, we've got over 123,000 registered hedgehog champions, which is fantastic. So that's people who've signed up and pledged to help hedgehogs. So yeah, we've got a growing army, a growing community of people helping hedgehogs, which is absolutely fantastic. And of course, there are a lot of ways to help hedgehogs. I know a lot of people on this call will already be doing a lot of these things, so I won't go through all of them in detail. But one of the key things that we promote is this idea of hedgehog highways. So you can see one pictured on the right-hand side there. Small gaps in fences or under fences to help hedgehogs move around. So that fragmented habitat is a real issue, unfortunately. You know, they need to travel sort of a mile or 2 miles in a single night. And if there's walls, if there's buildings everywhere, it really just inhibits them from doing that. So it's just about opening up that habitat, letting them into your garden, because we know that gardens can be really, really important for them. So yeah, this idea of hedgehog highways. Think about a CD case. We always say this, CD case is about the right size, so 13 centimeters up and across, and that's going to let even the biggest hedgehogs through. And then beyond that, there's loads of other things that you can do. You're sort of getting rid of hazards and chemicals, things like that, and then promoting wildlife friendly gardening. So nice features, think things like log piles, leaf piles. Try not to be too tidy in the garden, just let it grow a little bit wild, and that's going to help hedgehogs, but it is also going to help a lot of other species. So think things like birds, bats, pollinators. You're going to get a nice abundance of those if you give over your garden and share it with wildlife. And if you've got no garden, that's no problem. I'm not having any of this, oh, I can't help because I've got no garden. There's lots of other things that you can do. One of the really key things is just raising awareness. So speaking to to land managers. So if you haven't got a garden, you could contact your local council, you could contact developers, sports pitches, you know, golf courses, things like that, and just let them know that, you know, there's ways that they can help hedgehogs as well. Sharing stuff on social media. It's Hedgehog Awareness Week this week, so there's loads going around on social media. Share things like that, just help us to try and reach new audiences with the message of, you know, helping hedgehogs and what we're trying to achieve. You could do some volunteering with a rescue, that would be good fun. And you can also help other wildlife out. You know, you could put some window boxes up or something like that, help pollinators with some nice wildflowers. So yeah, it doesn't have to be in the garden. There's lots of different things that you can do to help. Another great way to help is with the PTS Living with Mammals survey. So I'm giving it a bit of a plug because we've just launched this year's survey a few weeks ago. So this is a survey that you can do either in the garden, or if you don't have a garden, you could use a local green space. And it's essentially recording the mammals that you see. So of course, that includes hedgehogs. But if you see, you know, any of the things on the right-hand side there, foxes, if you see badgers, rabbits, anything like that. And we're looking for sightings, but you can also have a look around for things like droppings or tracks or signs, you know, if you've seen them on a wildlife camera. And it would just be a record of effort as well. So if you just let us know how long you've been out there sort of counting, whether it's an hour, whether it's half an hour, it's good for us to know that. So if that's something you're interested in getting involved with, just head over to that website there, ptes.org/LWM. And that's a really good survey. I wanted to do a quick roundup of last year, a couple of the key projects that we undertook. So back in February, we do talk about this a lot, so sorry if everybody's heard it before. We produced the State of Britain's Hedgehogs Report 2022. And that was quite an interesting one. So that built on previous reports that we had published. And what we found with that was an increasing disparity between urban and rural areas. So in rural areas, we've unfortunately got a sort of continued decline. You know, they're facing a lot of different threats and pressures in rural areas. So it was very much a continued decline. So we know that we've lost between 30 and 75% of hedgehogs in rural areas since 2000 in different areas of Britain. But in slightly more positive news, we did find that on the urban side of things, in our urban and suburban areas, it's more of a stable population. And there's actually very early signs of recovery as well after those declines that have gone before. So it was a little bit of good news, but we can't, you know, it's not a job done situation. We very much need to kind of keep doing what we're doing to try and get them back up to the levels that they have been in the past. So a little bit of good news, but just yeah, to be taken with a bit of caution. The other project that we ran last year was a nationwide competition, and that was to find Britain's biggest hedgehog street. So we ran that last summer, and that was really good fun. We got a lot of fantastic entries. It was great to see what everybody had been doing. And we were looking for the most connected gardens on one street in Britain. So we were trying to find that. We got loads of great entries, and the winner ended up being Dale Road in Keyworth, which is a village, or a town, I should say, in Nottinghamshire. And they were part of a fantastic local group. And there's a picture here on the right hand side of me presenting the winners of, you know, the Dale Road winners with their very special plaque to commemorate their win. And they had, I think it was 42 hedgehog highways across the whole street, which was fantastic, really, really good effort. And, you know, as a result of that, they had a thriving hedgehog population. They were all kind of seeing them in the garden, which was great. So just a really nice example of what can be done, you know, and if you make these efforts, then you'll get to see lots of hedgehogs, which is a fantastic reward, and possibly even a plaque as well, if you're very lucky. I wanted to mention as well some of the upcoming plans that we've got for this year. So one thing that we're doing is trying to contact fencing suppliers. So there's a couple of examples here of fencing products that have an inbuilt hedgehog highway. So it's a gravel board that you can buy for the base of your fence, and it's got that highway already in for when you're replacing your fencing. So it's fantastic that these products exist. They're absolutely great, but we want to see more of them. So we're currently planning a campaign where we're going to ask you all, our hedgehog champions, to write to companies, so whether it's fencing manufacturers, suppliers, sellers, and ask them to put more hedgehog friendly options in their ranges. So I won't say too much more just because we're sort of still planning that, but certainly keep an eye out because that's something that we're going to be asking for your help with. Another thing that we've been working on for the past few months, and probably the next few months, is a brand new national hedgehog conservation strategy. So we previously worked with a strategy that was drafted by ourselves with a number of partners a few years back, but we wanted to produce a new one with sort of incorporating all of the research findings from the past few years. And also we wanted to bring in input from wider stakeholders. So we've been working with the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. We've brought together researchers, hedgehog carers, but also people like landowners, farmers, people from the travel and infrastructure industries, really trying to have as big a range of people as possible represented in this strategy. So back in January, we did a one-day workshop, and that was a threat analysis workshop. So we basically brainstormed all of the threats that hedgehogs are facing in Britain. We just hashed them all out, just kind of got them all down. And then what we did is try to start to map them out and link them together, and look at each threat and just look at what's driving it and, you know, what the result of that threat is to hedgehogs. So that was a really fantastic session. We brought in lots of different people for that. So we had a lot of different voices represented to really try and get to the bottom of actually what the key things are that are affecting hedgehogs. We then moved on to a 3-day workshop, which was last week. So I think a lot of us are still recovering from that because it was a very intense workshop. And that was to sort of put together the strategy. So we took all of those threats that we'd looked at in January, and we kind of brought those together to devise new strategies to address those threats. So we're kind of finalising all of that at the moment. We should have something to share within the next few months, hopefully. So do keep an eye out for that. We are also in the process of launching a pilot national hedgehog monitoring programme with our partners at the Institute of Zoology, as well as Durham University and Nottingham Trent University. So that's going to be a 3-year pilot, and we're using camera traps to sort of estimate numbers of hedgehogs at different sites across Britain, kind of looking at different land classes, looking at how hedgehog numbers and distribution are changing year on year. And hopefully this is going to be a more detailed approach than previous surveys and methods. So that should give us some really good information. And as part of this, there's going to be some volunteer opportunities down the line. So we'll definitely keep you all posted about that and just how you can get involved as we progress the project. So we are very busy. There's a few kind of ongoing projects at the moment, but all good things. So I think that's, so now we can introduce our very special guest for the evening. So we're delighted to be joined by author and researcher Dr. Tom Moorhouse. So a quick intro of Tom and his work, and then we can sort of bring him out and start asking him all of our questions. So Tom's an ecologist and author, and he's been working for over 22 years for the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford University, and he's now working as an independent researcher. His research work began with single species conservation issues, so that included water voles, signal crayfish, and of course hedgehogs. And then he moved on to methods for reducing global demand for wildlife products, and that's an area that he still works in. His literary career, he's been very busy, he's researching and he's writing things. His literary career has comprised a number of children's books, including The River Singers, The Rising and Trickster, all of which drew on ecological knowledge of water voles and rats. And his adult non-fiction comprises Elegy for a River and more recently Ghosts in the Hedgerow. So I won't give too much away about the book. I've got my copy here for reference. I won't give too much away, but it's a fantastic book. And I'll give a bit of an idea of the kind of plot, just so you know kind of what we're talking about if you haven't had a chance to read it, but I would definitely recommend reading it. It centers around a very dramatic murder, so it's sort of in the style of a whodunit book, and it centers around the murder of a fictional hedgehog character, and then Tom goes on to investigate each suspect, in inverted commas, in turn. So looking at the research around various hedgehog threats. And yeah, it has been featured in Private Eye, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, and it has of course been reviewed on the Hedgehog Street website, most importantly. You can get your copy on the PTES website, and we've got copies in our online shop, so do certainly get a copy there, and that money will go back into our conservation work. And we do actually have a giveaway running on our Facebook page, I believe. I think that's launched this evening, and that's for Hedgehog Awareness Week, so you've got a chance to win a signed copy of the book, so do head over and enter that. And then, yeah, let's bring on Tom. Have we got you there, Tom?
Hello.
Hello. Let me just, bear with. Let's see if I can spotlight you. And then Tom's very kindly going to give us a reading of his book. So, yeah, Tom's going to give us a reading just to give us a bit of a flavour of the book and get us all hooked. So, yeah, I'll hand over to you, Tom. Do you want to take it away, and then we'll go into some questions afterwards?
Absolutely. So, as Grace said, it's kind of arranged as interrogating each of the suspects. So I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the start of the chapter that deals with Mr. Clarkson, the chauffeur, who's our first suspect. Let's start with the obvious. Hedgehogs get run over. A lot. Hence the plethora of jokes, which I will refrain from repeating. And you'd have to imagine that the sheer quantity of vehicularly mandated hedgehog inflattenings would leave a fairly substantial dent in their populations, and of course extremely substantial dents in individual hedgehogs. A cursory glance at the National Hedgehog and Traffic Statistics certainly appears to bear this out. In 1950, there were 4 million vehicles on British roads and an estimated 36 million hedgehogs snuffling about. Since then, the fortunes of cars and hedgehogs have diverged in a suspiciously inversely correlated fashion. Traffic has surged year on year. 20 million vehicles in the 1980s, 27 million by 2000, and almost 33 million in 2020. Meanwhile, estimates of the national hedgehog population plummeted to 1.5 million in 1995 and further to a measly 500,000 in 2018, our most recent estimate. These estimates indicate a 98% decline in hedgehogs in 4 decades, during which the traffic increased 6-fold. Scarier still are the numbers of hedgehogs engaging in sadly one-sided altercations with motor vehicles. Recent estimates suggest that in 1993 we may have had 230,000 hedgehog road deaths. Taking the closest population estimate from 1995, that approximates to 15% of all the hedgehogs alive at the time. The road death estimate for 2016 was between 167,000 and 335,000. In the context of the nearest population estimate from 2018, that equates to 30 to 60% of all British hedgehogs in existence. The revealed trend is of ever-increasing car numbers, resulting in ever-increasing percentages of an ever-decreasing national hedgehog population being wiped out on the road. And now, every year, cars kill hedgehogs in quantities that veer perilously close to the sum total of all the British hedgehogs alive. So I'm afraid this is going to be a rather short book. Which ends on page 17, so that's clearly not the end of the story.
I'd like that if it ended by saying, this is a short, the end, yeah, that's it.
That's my money earned.
Thank you very much for that reading. I think that just kind of shows the sort of, it's a nice kind of little glimpse of what the book's about. So it's a nice balance of, you've got this sort of murder in the background and it's, you know, there's a bit of lightheartedness, but then you're kind of going through each issue and just exploring, you know, what we know, what we don't know, the kind of, you know, what figures do we have on different things. So I think it's a really nice book. I think it's good if you kind of know a lot about hedgehogs, because it just kind of really explores that. And even if you don't know a lot, I think it's a nice kind of introduction to all the ins and outs of the hedgehog decline. So yeah, thank you very much for giving us a reading.
Welcome.
Starting off with a little bit about you, if that's okay. So I was just wondering if you could talk us through your research background, because I kind of briefly mentioned that you've been at the University of Oxford. So how did you kind of get into conservation and research? What was your sort of pathway in?
So I always wanted to sort of work with animals, and I kind of explored being a vet for a while, and I had a slight aberration. So I went to Durham University when I was sort of 18 to with intent on becoming a biochemist. Duly failed the chemistry option of my first year I got 25% in my exams, but did quite well in the biology. Gave up being a biochemist and sort of reverted back to wanting to be an ecologist. And since then, it's just been, that's what I wanted to be. So I did a master's in York. Then I kind of I volunteered in Oxford University for a while because they were doing some cool stuff with mammals. Then I got a job working for Cambridge University for a while. And then Oxford lured me back to do a PhD on water voles. And after my PhD, I was fortunate enough to, which PhD was co-funded by the PTS, I should mention. So, you've had quite a hand in my career. And after that, I was fortunate enough to get a postdoc. I was actually reintroducing water voles, and then moved on to crayfish, hedgehogs, and then just departed from sort of working on single species and started basically trying to figure out how to tell people to behave themselves around wildlife. And that's kind of what I've been doing ever since. So it's been quite a weirdly varied career.
Yeah, no, it sounds cool. It's an interesting path to have kind of looked at those individual species and then kind of moved into the broader picture. The sort of water voles and hedgehogs are on a bit of a theme, but the crayfish stuff is maybe a bit random. Is that fair to say?
No, not so much, actually. I think it's a similar theme in that, I mean, water voles are going extinct in the UK at a fairly rapid rate and have been for some time due to American mink. I think most people know that, which is invasive species. Now the crayfish, our native crayfish, the white claws, are pretty much been eradicated, apart from just a few sites around the country, again by a non-native invasive predator, American signal crayfish. And those were deliberately introduced in 1976 to create this amazing fishery that we were going to be, fishing out American signal crayfish and selling them abroad, and there'd be all sorts of amazing markets. None of which happened, but what did happen is they got out of the ponds that we put them in, into the watercourses, and they are present in incredible numbers in our rivers. It's obviously not on the hedgehogs, but my favorite thing to ask people, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Grace, is I was tasked with pulling signal crayfish out of 400 meters of river in Oxfordshire in 64 days. How many do you reckon I caught? 400 meters.
Oh God, I don't know. This isn't crayfish aren't really my I feel like it could be millions or it could be like one. I'm guessing it's closer to the higher. Must have been.
It was 27,500 from 400 meters, and that's only the big one. So it's the same sort of thing. It's it's an invasive species running amok. In this case, under the water. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah, I'll pull us back from the crayfish tangent, but that's quite interesting. Yeah, like you say, there's more similarities than you would think between some of the species that you've studied. You've mentioned water voles a couple of times, so they're in your other book. Can you tell us a little bit about Elegy for a River? For those who might not have read it.
So I can show you. It's
you've got it there. Perfect.
There you go. It's a much less monochrome. This is hitting the Ghosts in the Hedgerow is very much hitting the noir fiction, whereas Elegy for Rivers is much more riparian. So that was basically just charting how I got into working on people from having worked on single species. So it describes kind of what it's like being a field researcher and the things you discovered and it's a lot about the frustrations, the daily frustrations of being in the field, but also the sorts of things you can find out about your species, how conservation works, essentially how conservation research works. And the major conclusion of Elegy for a River is that when I started working on water voles, it was fair to say we didn't really know how to solve the water vole problem. We didn't really know if they could be reintroduced well. You didn't really know if we could control American mink in order to allow them to be reintroduced. By the time I was finished working, due to efforts of a lot of people up and down the country, we knew that we could reintroduce water voles. We knew we could control American mink. We had all the tools available to sort water voles out in perpetuity. We knew we could do it. It'd probably take 10 years. Have we done it? No. I stopped working on them in 2008, and they're in a far worse position now than they were when I stopped working, despite the fact we knew at that point how to solve the problem. And the problem, therefore, isn't that we need to do more research. Authorities kind of like us to do research because research is relatively cheap. To sort out water voles is probably going to be somewhere between 100 and 150 million pounds to do the job properly. And there isn't a government that's going to provide that amount of money. And so I was able to, the path of Elegy for a River was basically trying to say, listen, take people on exactly the same journey that I went on, get to the same point, be sort of invested in the outcome and say, listen, the outcome is, we can sort this out. It's just, we have the tools, but we don't have enough participation from the governments and from key authorities to sort of get this done. But there is optimism, we can absolutely rewild Britain if we want to.
Yeah. I was just going to say it all sounds a bit depressing, but I should say that the book is actually, it's really funny, and it's I think within a few pages you talk about you've fallen into some watercourse, so it's kind of the lighter side of things, isn't it? It's quite a nice balance. And I would say that about this book as well. It's kind of got there is the depressing stuff, but there's also kind of messages of hope, which I think is really important.
That's kind of the key that I found is, I mean, these are, conservation is a big issue. It's one that everyone feels very strongly. I mean, I'm very passionate about it, but that doesn't mean you can't kind of laugh at it at the same time. It's very easy to write a depressing, they call it mourn porn, conservation mourn porn. It's like, oh, isn't everything terrible? But actually, things aren't as terrible. There's a lot of reason for optimism, and there's quite a lot of funny stuff involved, so there's a lot of,
Yeah, I think a lot of field researchers could tell some tales. I think there's a lot of strange things involved. I've heard some things, which is quite funny. So you sort of focused on water voles, but what was the kind of, what made you move on to hedgehogs for the next book? Was it kind of because you'd already sort of done some research in that area? Although actually, can you talk us through your hedgehog research, because we haven't really talked about that. What was your hedgehog project? So
my hedgehog project was kind of, it was depressing in one sense that I only saw one hedgehog for the entire, I worked on it for 3 years, again sort of funded by the People's Trust, and but my job was I had 2 jobs basically. I had the job of trying to work out what a minimum viable population of hedgehogs looks like, as in what's the minimum number of animals that, if you left them alone, you wouldn't expect them to go extinct in 100 years. It's going to be more than 2. It's probably going to be fewer than like 6,000. So you need to get somewhere in there is the number. And then you can work out how much space those hedgehogs require. All of which required basically trawling through the literature, trying to find estimates for how many litters of hoglets, I'm thinking water voles, how many litters of hoglets hedgehogs can have, how many times a year, how likely they are to survive, what the sex ratio is, all of these things, and how that varies in different locations. And then you plug that into a sort of something called Vortex, which is a simulation package. So I didn't really get out into the field very much. I spent most of my time sitting behind a computer. And the other project I was involved with was, again, we set a bunch of computerized hedgehogs free in a simulated landscape just to see if we double the amount of hedgerow or triple the amount of hedgerow in an agricultural landscape, would that make it more permeable? So for 3 years, I worked on hedgehogs without actually working on real life hedgehogs.
Yeah, I think you can kind of lose sight sometimes, because when you're working with this species that, that they're not kind of walking around everywhere, you sort of lose sight sometimes. You've got to kind of pull yourself back and remind yourself what you're actually studying. So was that because you'd done that research, was that kind of what led you into doing the
I think
book?
Yes. I mean, there were a few good reasons to move on. I mean, again, it's some sort of similarity. It's actually weirdly, crayfish are more similar to water voles in terms of the conservation problems they face. Hedgehogs have completely different conservation problems to water voles. Water voles, and that was kind of one of the key reasons that it was nice to write this book, because it's a completely different approach you need to take. Because water voles, they tend to stay, where they're going to be. They're going to be by the river. They don't have big ranges, especially, it's somewhere between 40 to 300 meters. It's very easy to get an estimate of a population in an area. It's very easy to get an estimate of how many there are nationally, and to sort of compare that with hedgehogs. You can't do any of that. You can't get a national population estimate, or at least not a reliable one. And water voles, there's one key reason or 2 key reasons they're in decline, one of which is American mink, the other one of which is habitat fragmentation. And it was pretty obvious from a fairly early stage that that's what was happening. With hedgehogs, there are 4 or 5 different candidates that could be causing it, and they're not mutually exclusive. And so trying to unpick all that was a big challenge. And I was thinking, that's why it's nice to write a book on a very different type of conservation problem.
Yeah, definitely. Someone's just asking, is the book aimed at children or adults or both? Predominantly adults.
Predominantly adults, yeah. I think if you're a childish adult, then it's probably perfect, because that's kind of how I see myself. But yeah, I think if if it's a child, I think if they're sort of 12 years old plus and they're really into their conservation, then I think, be definitely suitable for them. But younger than that, no, not so much.
Yeah, probably I would agree with that. And then, so that was kind of why you decided to do a hedgehog book. You had all of this, all of this knowledge from the, the research and the modeling work that you'd done. But then why did you make it a whodunit? What was the kind of the thinking there? Because it's not a traditional, it's not like a traditional model for a conservation book, is it? It is a bit kind of a bit off the wall.
Yeah, that's not your usual way. I mean, so normally a conservation book is, it's anecdotes about how beautiful nature is to really invest the reader, and then, kind of get some hard facts to sort of really kick. But I was trying to explain it, actually, the whodunit bit, I was trying to explain to my brother-in-law. It was early days, and I was trying to think, how on earth am I going to write a book about hedgehogs? Because for all the reasons I've just explained, it's very difficult to kind of unpick what exactly is happening with them. It's like, it's like kind of like there's a murder going on, but instead of there being two key suspects, there's sort of four suspects. And as I was talking, I was thinking, well, yeah, it kind of is like a whodunit, because if the passage I just read out, it sounds like an open and shut case. Cars are killing lots and lots of hedgehogs. Surely that's the major thing. But as soon as you start delving beneath the surface of the statistics, you realize that there's a heck of a lot more going on. And so it really, it's a story that's full of red herrings. And so the more and more I was thinking about it, the more I was chatting with him, I was thinking it has to be done as a whodunit, because we have four key suspects. It's not entirely obvious which of them are to blame, and that really, and it provides a kind of a nice, fairly light-hearted, if noirish framework to sort of hang the structure on, because that way you've got an introduction, you got your four key suspects, you go through them all, and then you've got your conclusion. And so that's a book that structures itself.
Yeah, I really like the structure of it, because I get a lot of emails from people, and it's a bit like, well, the reason for hedgehog decline is this. It's it's chemicals.
It isn't.
It's roadkill, and it's a bit like, if it was that clear cut, obviously it would be a lot easier in terms of the conservation.
Exactly.
But as you say, it's a lot of different things. It's a lot of different kind of factors at play, and it's about kind of exploring each one. And actually, it's kind of the full picture, which is a quite a sort of quite a juicy one. I quite like the idea of it as well, because obviously it's working with hedgehogs, and they're our favorite mammal. People really love them, and it's a bit like, I quite like that within the book. It's a bit like, why would someone kill this this beloved, who would have it in for the hedgehog? But it's quite interesting, because it's not a kind of deliberate thing that's happening. It's kind of lots of indirect things that are sort of affecting it. So why do you think that they're Britain's favorite mammal? I quite like asking people this. What do you think it is? You said in the book about the sort of a bit gangly and a bit kind of a bit wobbly. Is it what do you think it is?
I think it's two things. I think it's familiarity, in that they come into people's gardens. So people see them on a nightly basis, and so it's this, people, it's a hackneyed expression, but people love, people want to save what they love, and people love the things that they are familiar with and that they're a part of their world. And hedgehogs will come into your garden on a nightly basis, but obviously so do rats, but people don't feel the same way about rats. I think because hedgehogs are completely innocuous, they don't harm anybody. Their principal defense is to curl into a ball. Otherwise they're just perfectly happy sort of pootling about. They're perfectly happy to come near you. They're a wild animal that you can get up close and personal with, and just, you shouldn't get too up close and personal with them, obviously, but it's just, they become a beautiful part of people's lives that you can just watch and feel good about them being there, I think. And as soon as something like that is absent, people notice. So I think it's just the fact that they're largely an urban species these days.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's as well that they're so funny looking. I think we've got a bit of a it's kind of, we've got this weird obsession with things that are a bit quirky and a bit unusual, and I think that's part of the reason as well, because they do, obviously they're our only spiny mammal in in the UK, and they are just a bit funny looking when you see them, and they don't quite blend in. They're just kind of snuffling along. So I think that's, I always quite like asking people about that, because everyone's got a slightly different idea, and everyone loves them for different reasons as well. So I wanted to ask as well about the kind of writing process. Did you, because obviously there's a lot of research mentioned in the book, because there has been a lot of hedgehog research, which is brilliant. Did you speak to the researchers first and then kind of craft the book around that, or did you already have the kind of bones of what you wanted to say and then you sort of slotted in the researcher stuff afterwards, or was it a bit of a mishmash of everything?
So when you're writing a non-fiction book, so I mean, I came from a background of writing fiction, and the way you do that is you write the fiction book and you go and see if anyone wants to read it. You take it to a bunch of publishers and they kind of go, no, it's not for me, or oh yeah, I like that. Non-fiction doesn't work like that at all. Non-fiction, you have to pretty much have written the book in miniature and take that to a publisher, and it's a horrendous process. So you have to kind of know what you want to say up front, and then kind of write a very reduced version of it, sort of 15,000 words of the whole book in the style that you're going to write it in, without having actually written the book first. So because I'd sort of worked on hedgehogs, I knew what the suspects were going to be, look at it that way. And I actually say this in the book, and it's perfectly true, that my time spent working on hedgehogs sort of furnished me with knowing who the major suspects were going to be. But it's fair to say I didn't know when I sat down to write which one or which ones were going to be the key players by the time I finished. And that's when I started talking to the real experts, the guys who are doing this on the ground and have got all the up-to-date information. Basically, I chatted with so many amazing hedgehog experts, and they were all massively generous with their time, when they didn't have any good reason to be. And, we just had lovely chats about hedgehogs, and we all kind of ended up agreeing on the main causes, which is great. And that kind of convinced me that, I was going the right way. And I also mugged them for all their best anecdotes, because in Elegy for a River, I was able to sort of speak from my own experience of fieldwork on that species, so on the water voles and crayfish, and sort of give all the stupid things that happened to me in the field and the number of times a water vole had urinated on me and things like that. With hedgehogs, as I said, I spent 3 years sitting basically behind a computer, so I mugged the experts for their anecdotes and then shared the worst things that happened to them. So, and they were, again, they had no reason to sort of let me do that, but it was brilliant that they did.
Yeah, I suppose your anecdotes from your research might not be as exciting because, like you said, it was sort of a desk-based kind of research project, wasn't it? So I got
terrible RSI from clicking the mouse.
It's not quite as good as
doesn't do the job.
For the anecdote side of things, definitely. So obviously coming into the book, you'd worked with you'd done all your research, you'd sort of done your modelling study. But was there anything in the process of writing the book, was there anything that really kind of surprised you? Was there anything where you sort of hadn't seen it coming?
I think that there was one major thing surprised. I mean, there was one thing about hedgehogs surprised me, which was just how difficult it is to pin down what's going on, what's causing the conservation problem. It was, I described earlier, you get these big correlations between, hedgehogs going one way and the correlating factor going up, the massive decline in hedgehogs and massive increase in cards. It looks like an open and shut case, but it isn't. And then you have to do some really detailed work to unpick the reasons for that. And then you have some correlations, like sort of the increase in tidy-mindedness, that just sound like nothing. And yet, when you go into it, it's kind of that increase in tidy-mindedness amongst sort of householders in the UK is a massive contributing factor. And similarly, sort of among sort of farm owners and landowners. And so that was a big surprise that the things that seem relatively innocuous, actually, when you think about it, are actually far from that, and vice versa. Other than that is just how persecuted they've been over the years. Look at some of the accounts from the 19th century where you have sort of people boasting about, hunting down 30 hedgehogs a night because they're eating their ground nesting birds and things like that. I mean, firstly, that shows there must have been a massive hedgehog population. And secondly, it's, just, as I say, how persecuted they've been. But the one fact that surprised me more than any, and it sounds completely irrelevant, is the distance between the Earth and the Moon. That distance is big enough to fit every planet in our solar system. I found out that fact when I was writing, and it really surprised me. And it's relevant to hedgehogs because that distance on average between the Earth and the Moon is 385,000 kilometers. And if you were to measure out in terms of sort of Earth to Moon how much hedgerow we lost since 1940s, it would get all the way to the Moon and most of the way back again, 3/4 of the way back again. That's how much hedgerow we lost from the UK in a very few decades. So that to me, I knew that we'd lost a lot of hedgerow, and you see we've lost 600,000 kilometers. But as soon as you think, okay, that's almost gets you around every single planet in the solar system, that's just mind blowing that we did that.
Yeah, definitely, and that's a really crucial habitat for hedgehogs as well. The clues in the name with that one, they do that's a habitat that they do live in. We've had a question in from the chat, so I'm just going to read it off here. So volunteer rescues play a really important part in helping hedgehogs survive. There are lots across the country doing amazing work in getting poorly hedgehogs back into the wild when otherwise they would have died. Have you been able to include this into your modelling and research? So obviously your research was a few years back, but is that something that fed in, or was it more kind of natural, kind of ecological factors?
It wasn't. It wasn't something I was able to fit in simply because I was coming at it from the other way, if you see what I mean. It's looking at sources of mortality and birth rates in different habitats, and so the rescues kind of deal with what happens when hedgehogs kind of meet humans, almost, if you see what I mean. I guess it's fair to say that a lot of the hedgehogs that are taken in because of things that we've done, whether we've changed the environment or whatever. But what I was trying to get at with the modeling was to look at, okay, so in urban areas, because of the lower mortality rates and the better, and they're warmer environments and there's more food available, so you tend to get larger litters. So therefore you need, and they're more stable environments, they're less prone to changing year on year. And so you can have fewer hedgehogs in an urban area that constitutes a stable population. Whereas in agricultural areas, there are larger fluctuations year on year. There's a little bit less food available. There are far more predators around. And so you need more hedgehogs to constitute a stable population. So that was the sort of conclusion I was coming up with. And then you can sort of work out how much urban area you need, contiguous urban area, to be a stable population of hedgehogs, and how much you'd need in agricultural areas. So I wasn't really able to sort of bring in people releasing hedgehogs that have sort of been nursed back to health. If you like, that would contribute to the sort of mortality estimates being lower in urban areas. Look at it that way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. Where's my question gone? Yeah, so the last chapter of the book is quite upbeat, and it does end on a bit of a note of hope after kind of traveling through all the issues associated with the decline. Had you always planned to have that in, or did you kind of decide that it was needed because when you wrote it was all a bit depressing? Was that always the plan to kind of finish on actually what are the next steps? What can we do?
I think I'm an optimist. I've been working as a conservation researcher for a long time, and you could get very downhearted very quickly if you weren't an optimist. I think most of us are fully aware of how bad things are, but also just hoping we can keep persuading people. And I think there's no point finishing a book saying, well, we're all doomed. And I don't believe that anyway. I think that people genuinely want to help. They often don't have the tools, or you can ask people to do too much, and everybody's kind of got busy lives, you've got stuff going on. But if you were to say to people, listen, we can save hedgehogs and the majority of wildlife by making 3 simple changes in what you're doing every day, That's something you can hold in your head, And so what I'm trying to do is create an argument at the end of the book for those few simple things that you can do, and to show that actually, if everybody did that, we would be well on the way to sorting out a whole bunch of stuff, not just for hedgehogs, but for many, many, many agricultural species the world over. And I honestly believe the evidence shows, that's true, that we just need to make a few simple changes each. And, I know enough about sort of behavior change in humans to know that, social norms can flip very quickly. Once enough people start talking about something or doing it, making a change, like No Mow May, for example, is, it makes headlines every year. A few years ago, no one had heard of it. Yep. But now, if you have a scruffy garden, I say scruffy, I mean exuberant, but, your neighbors aren't looking over your fence going, that's scruffy. They're going, you're doing No Mow May. Or, and now you can, because there's a label you can put on it and it's being advertised, if someone says, hey, look at the state of your garden, you can say, well, I'm doing No Mow May. And actually it's a good thing for these reasons. Why isn't your garden like this? And the social norm switches very quickly. And I think you can do that with, I just give a few bits of advice at the end of the book. I think that's easily achievable to sort of change a social norm and spread that around.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good message to sort of end on. So you kind of touched on it, you might have people looking over your fence and saying, why haven't you mowed your lawn? How do you think that we can reach people who aren't necessarily kind of wildlife minded? Because, there's a lot of people helping hedgehogs, which is fantastic, and it makes them a pleasure to work with. But then there's a lot of people that are sort of harder to reach, and they're in their mindset of tidy garden, plastic grass, all these things that we kind of shudder at. But do you have any thoughts on kind of how do we sort of reach these audiences, other than writing a book, of course?
I think it spreads itself. I think the more you do it and the more you talk to people, and everybody understand, people will do stuff if they understand why it's a good idea. I was on Reddit, occasionally, I've got a small child, and occasionally I just take a break and sort of scroll through Reddit. And I saw this guy he had a before and after his garden that he was very proud of. And he had basically taken this garden and he had just astroturfed the whole thing, put in some decking and a nice concrete path, brand new fences, which is absolute anathema to me. And I was kind of sitting there, kind of feeling a bit angry, and then I read through the comments underneath, and it was comment after comment after comment of people saying, what the heck have you done to your garden? Don't you know that's bad for wildlife? Don't you know this? Don't you know that? My goodness, And so I immediately felt a lot better, because there are other people, doing it for me, And
no, I think that's true.
That's a changing social norm. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the message is definitely getting out there, as you say. And that's hopefully a good thing. We're sort of moving in the right direction. And there's ways to, incorporate all these things. It's like you say, it's small changes. It doesn't need to be anything huge. This is the line that I'm always kind of saying in talks, and when I'm kind of out talking to people at events and things. It doesn't need a huge garden. It doesn't need all these expensive changes. It's almost more of a kind of attitude shift, and having a few wild bits, and you're going to end up seeing a lot of things. And I think hedgehogs are really good for that. You might see a hedgehog and then start thinking, oh well, maybe I'll put in a log pile, maybe I'll put in a bird feeder, and it just kind of gets people thinking, because they're such a great species to sort of they're flagship species, aren't they? They get
absolutely
involved as well. I'm just having a quick look. I'm conscious that we've not got loads of time left. Someone was asking on the chat, what has the response to the book been like? Are there any particular aspects of it that people kind of have honed in on? Do you think that has any implications for ways forward in terms of getting people involved? It's quite an interesting question.
I haven't had any specific feedback. I think the response has been very positive. I've seen a few reviews and people have been very, very kind about it. I think, that my niche as an author, I suppose, is to take all the sort of complicated sort of studies and try and translate them into something that's easy to sort of digest for a lay reader. And I think that's, people have responded well to that. I think that's, I've seen that a few times. It's like, thank you, saying you've taken a complicated subject and made it sort of easy and fun sort of thing. I think in terms of ways forwards for getting people involved, I think it's just, for me, that is the way forwards. It's to explain what the process of academic research is, what the uncertainties are, and what the actions are that come out of that. You explain that to people, and then they're kind of happy to get on board. If you say, because that's the reason we're doing it, and I see that, and it's explained why it's important, and well, not so much explained, but you show people why it's important, and get that. And I think again, it's that repetition of, once you've understood why these things are important, you're happy to do it, and you're happy to see other people do it. And if and it gives you a sort of comeback if anybody was to say, why aren't they mowing the verges? Why is the council being lazy? You say, well, because firstly, it's saving the council money. Secondly, it's saving our wildlife when we're in the middle of insect Armageddon. So, and surely that's a good thing. And, there's no comeback to that, basically.
Yeah, it's a win-win, isn't it? It's helping the wildlife and it's saving money. So who can complain? What's
the problem? Yeah,
exactly. I hope everyone's involved in No Mow May. I know that I am, but it's more just because I just haven't mowed the lawn yet. I just can't be bothered. So I'm just doing it. I'm doing it by accident, but it's working a treat. Got all these lovely wildflowers, lots of bees.
Perfect.
I'm just having a last look to see if there's been any more questions. I'm a little bit conscious of time. If you've got any, maybe just kind of top line stuff for this, what would you say that farmers can do to help hedgehogs? We surely can't let the hedgehog become a solely urban animal.
So hedgerows, yeah. I mean, hedgerows, we've lost 600,000 kilometers of hedgerows, for an animal that kind of lives in hedgerows. And, hedgerows are vital for all sorts of farmland species, from invertebrates upwards, they just need replacing, and they need replacing pretty pronto. And in terms, that alone, I think would solve a lot of problems. I mean, there's a trade-off between efficiency of farms and sort of farming for wildlife. So it's probably a bit much to ask, farmers to sort of forego a lot of the agrochemicals that are being used and a lot of the heavy machinery, but we desperately need to get the hedgerows reinstated. Yeah,
I think there's a lot of good work being done in that area, kind of balancing the needs of farms and wildlife. And I should mention at this point that PTES has a really good hedgerow project where you can kind of survey hedgerows, and it just talks about all the importance of them and kind of management, because a well-managed hedgerow is really important as well. So if anybody's interested in kind of learning more about hedgerows, do certainly have a look on the PTS website. We'll go for, the time's got away from me, but we'll go for one general hedgehog question just to finish off, because we did have a few in, so I'm conscious that we sort of haven't answered everyone's questions. But you can always email in afterwards. You can drop us an email and I'll be happy to pass any questions to Tom. You're going to end up with like a massive long list probably. Sure. I know that we had a couple of emails today asking about cleaning hedgehog houses. This was things that people had kind of got in touch. What's a good time to clean them? I'm happy to sort of.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to know the answer.
That's okay. So you just want to avoid the key times of year where they're quite vulnerable. So avoiding the winter hibernation season, because we don't want to disturb a hibernating hedgehog. And then kind of from May onwards through the summer, because you're getting into the breeding season. So I would kind of say April-ish, because that's going to be after hibernation, before breeding, and then kind of October time before they go back into hibernation. But just checking really carefully to make sure there's not a hedgehog in situ. And if there is, just leave it. It's more important to not disturb the hedgehog than it is to sort of get it cleaned. I think that's all we've actually got time for. Sorry, I know there's been more questions, but there's sort of there's been a lot coming in. I think the time's got away from us a little bit. But I just want to say a really big thank you to everybody who's come along this evening. It's fantastic to see so many of you here. Thank you as well to Anina and Charlie for helping out and looking after the chat and the participants. And of course, thank you, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really good to chat and just kind of hear about the book and your work and everything. And yeah, I've been plugging it a lot, but one last plug is to buy a copy of Ghosts in the Hedgerow. Really, really good book. And yeah, you can buy it on the PTES website. Sorry we've not got through everybody's questions, but we'll try and host another evening with Hedgehog Street soon, and we could have just sort of more of a general chat about hedgehogs in the garden, just get everybody's questions answered in one go. But yeah, thank you again, everybody, and have a lovely bank holiday weekend. I hope you all see lots of hedgehogs, and yeah, enjoy the rest of Hedgehog Awareness Week. Thank you very much.